This is the Becoming Muslim podcast at untoislam.com, the show that helps people convert to Islam with hosts from the US, UK, and Australia.
So they're telling me like God saved you for a reason. I'm like, yeah, whatever. I don't even believe in God. I don't know why you keep telling me this, but it's sitting in the back of my mind. It's kind of like simmering. So I got this promise that I made, and I got this thought of like, did I really get saved? Like, should I think about this? So I decided, you know what, I'm going to take this seriously. Kind of issue with Judaism was more like there's like this too much emphasis on the bloodline and lineage and like, from the chosen people. And I'm like, well, I'm not from that. And then with Christianity, Trinity didn't make any sense to me, and Jesus being God and stuff like that. And Buddhism, the idolatry, that Buddhism turned into, and also not really believing in afterlife and the reincarnation and the evidence for reincarnation didn't really resonate with me. And then even though they have some nice principles for meditation and, life and mindfulness and all that stuff. And then Hinduism was just so much full of idol worship. And I'm like, did that idol, the little that I learned about Islam was like, it's idol worship just doesn't make sense. Why would you worship something that, people you've created with your own hands? I start narrowing it down. I'm like, you know what? For me, the only religion that actually potentially makes sense is actually Islam. But my process, I don't think it was that. It was more like, it was just a process of like resisting certain ideas. Like, this doesn't make sense. This doesn't make sense. And then I read it. I'm like, it's kind of starting to make sense a little bit now.
Welcome to the Becoming Muslim podcast at untoislam.com. This is the podcast where you can get information and everything you need to know on the topic of converting to Islam. Today we have a special guest. His name is Imam Mustafa Umar, and he's going to tell us his story about his journey from Islam to atheism and back. So he was born into Islam, but for some reason, and we're going to find out, he went to atheism and he came back to Islam. So let me give you a little bit of information now about Imam Mustafa. He's got a background in information computer science, and also he has a BA in Theology and Islamic Law from the European Institute of Islamic Sciences in France. He also has an MA in Islamic Studies from the University of Gloucestershire in UK. And he also studied Islamic Sciences for a year in Lucknow, India, and spent another year in Cairo, Egypt, studying Islam. He's authored several books, and we'll get into them also. He served the Muslim community in Southern California as an imam and activist for over a decade now. And he's currently the founder and the president of the California Islamic University. And he's the director of education and outreach at the Islamic Institute of Orange County. And lastly, he is an executive member of the Fit Council of North America. So that's a long list there, Imam Mustafa. You've been very busy.
Yeah, indeed. Indeed.
That's awesome. I'm really happy that you're really getting busy with all of that work. Give us a little introduction. Is there anything I missed there that you'd like the audience to know about yourself?
I've just, a few years back, I also got a license in IFTA, which basically gives you the title of what's called a traditional mufti. So specialist in Islamic law who basically gives authoritative answers to people's questions.
That's awesome. So I mentioned the books that you have written. All of these books are available on Amazon, and I will put the links to all of the books in the show notes if any of our listeners are interested. I'll just go through the list now. There's quite a long list. So the first book is How to Pray, a step-by-step guide to prayer in Islam. The next book, Welcome to Islam, a step-by-step guide for new Muslims. The next book, Muhammad, an authentic overview of his life and mission. Next one, Inspired Wisdom, Teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. Next, Recite the Quran Properly. Another one, Islamic Arabic, A Beginner's Guide. And then you have Reading the Quran in Arabic. Another book, Hajj and Umrah, A Practical and Spiritual Guide for the Journey. And another one here, Guide of the Believer, Purification and Prayer in Islam. So that's, I mean, you've been busy with writing books as well. Now, tell us about which of these books will be most relevant for our audience, and how will they benefit from it?
Sure. I mean, some of the, I think, when someone's looking into Islam, I highly, highly recommend the book Muhammad, which is really an overview of the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and kind of gives you a bird's eye view, like an overview about what is the Quran, what is Islam, how did it start, how did the revelation come to the Prophet, and things like that. So that would be, one of the books is really important. And then another one is, there's another one called Hidden Gems. And it's a shorter book. And then the longer one is Inspired Wisdom. This is a collection of hadith. And hadith is basically statements and actions or teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. So you got your Quran, which is like the direct revelation to the Prophet Muhammad. And then you have his own teachings and his statements and, stuff like that. So his teachings are separate. They're called hadith. So I would say that book, so the book Muhammad is like his life, give you an overview of Islam, the hadith books, Hidden Gems and Inspired Wisdom. And then if someone wants to know, like, hey, if I'm serious about actually accepting Islam and becoming Muslim, like what's going to happen when I become Muslim? Like, what am I supposed to do? Oftentimes people get the book Welcome to Islam, which is basically like what you do the first week after you accept Islam and like declare that you want to be Muslim. That's a perfect book for that to sometimes people read it in advance and they're like, I wonder what's going to happen, let me just read it now, even if I'm not interested at the moment.
That's awesome, Mustafa. Yeah, so looks like there's a lot of reading there. If anyone's interested, that's a great place to start. Anything else you'd like to tell us about your the books that you've written before we move on to the next subject?
I mean, just in general, I try to write books for people who start from very little knowledge or no knowledge of the subject. One of the reasons is because, when I started trying to learn about Islam myself on any subject, I pick up a book and sometimes there's a lot of things that are assumed, that like they kind of assume that they have some background information about this subject or this topic. They introduce people and stuff like that. So I try to make it so that every single term is defined from the get-go. So like introductory book on like how to start reading the Quran in Arabic, or if I write a book on the life of the Prophet or a guide of the believer, I don't assume that anyone already kind of knows the prayer or the purification or any of those things. So I kind of try to explain everything from scratch as if a person had zero going in, because I struggled on a personal level with that. So I'm kind of extra sensitive to that. I'm sure I'm not the only one going through that. So that's just kind of my style of writing.
That's great. And do you have any visual resources which go along with this? Maybe do you have a YouTube channel or something that supplements this?
I do. I have a YouTube channel. Channel is just Mustafa Umar. It's my name. I also have a Q&A website. It's called askthescholars.com. We make sure it's plural. Ask the Scholars is different. So Ask the Scholars. I actually answer questions and I give fatwas or religious, rulings on that. So people ask me different questions and I post it in a Q&A format on there. So these are some of the best resources there.
Excellent. Yeah, I'll put the link to that in the show notes as well. If anyone wants to ask any questions for Imam Mustafa, that's the best place to do it. Okay, any other resources that our listeners should be aware of?
That's it, except you mentioned the California Islamic University, which is a great place to take, online classes for people. We have several pre-recorded classes, 22 different subjects that we teach.
Okay, are any of them special courses for people, for new Muslims?
So actually, I mean, any level one class I think is really valuable. There's a class on the life of the Prophet, so kind of based on that book. There's a class on the teachings of the Prophet, his statements and his sayings based on inspired wisdom. There's a class on spirituality, teaching you about how to control your anger and how not to, be too greedy, and how to be humble and not become arrogant and all that. So there's a class on that's called purification of the heart. There's a class about like the basic things that what you do in prayer and fasting, and what fasting is about, and pilgrimage and all of that. And then a lot of times people like to even start learning a little bit of Arabic, because they're just kind of like interested in the culture as well as interested in the language. So we have Arabic language courses as well. So any one of those level one classes, there's even Islamic history class. So people want to know like, hey, what happened after the Prophet, and like, what about, the Abbasid empires, Ottoman Empire, which lands did Islam spread into? How did Islam come into Africa and the Far East and Indonesia and all of that stuff? So it's kind of classes really on all those subjects. Just depends on what really people are interested in. People tend to have, different interests and things like that. But any level one class, I think, would be a great start for people.
Yeah, I'm really impressed by the amount of work that you've been doing. It looks like you've been very busy. So let's talk about your story now. Our listeners, they're probably interested in what happened with you. You were born into Islam, and then you went to atheism. Would you like to share that story with us now?
Sure. I mean, I grew up in Southern California here in America, and I was, born into a Muslim family that was minimally practicing. We kind of grew up fasting in the month of Ramadan. Ramadan is a month where Muslims are supposed to fast. They don't eat, drink, have intimacy during the daytime, for an entire month. So that's kind of like we were taught fasting. In terms of prayers, Muslims are supposed to be praying 5 times a day. That really wasn't something that was part of our household. Sometimes we would go for Friday prayer, but that's kind of the extent. So it's kind of like, no pork, no alcohol. Parts of the things we practiced, partly we didn't really practice much. Went to Sunday school. Didn't really don't really remember much about it. Went also to public school as well as a Christian school 1 year. So that's kind of my background and upbringing. And then Islam was more of like a cultural thing. It's like, you grew up with, a certain type of dress. Some people grow up with certain type of food. Our culture was mostly American. The Islam was very minimal, but it kind of appeared like a cultural thing to us. So growing up, there really wasn't an understanding of what Islam is as a religion. Islam being a Muslim was kind of like an identity, like, yeah, okay, I'm Muslim, but I don't really know exactly what that means. I just know that I'm not supposed to drink alcohol. I'm not supposed to eat pork. I don't really know that much beyond it. But then what happened was, when I was in high school, we used to travel. My family used to travel every year in the winter time because my father was off from work. So we would go to different countries. And I think it was my junior year of high school where we traveled to Mecca for the first time. And I'd never been to Mecca in my life. And when I got there, it was just like this massive culture shock. It's something that I've never experienced before, because we had never been to a country where the call to prayer is being called out 5 times a day for each one of the prayers, that are spread throughout the day. And everyone like closes their shop. All the stores are closed and everyone's going to the mosque. And like in this massive, huge mosque. And it was just like, it was really shocking. It was surprising to me. Like it was like something that I've never experienced before. So that was like, I was kind of intrigued by that. And then I met some people who were kind of in my tour group, and there were some young Muslims who had recently, started practicing, becoming recommitted. And they started asking me and started talking to me like, hey, have you ever read like the Quran with like translation to try to understand it? I'm like, no, why would we do that? That doesn't really make sense. We were taught to learn how to read the Quran in Arabic, even though we didn't understand what was being said. So that's like part of the culture. Like all my Muslim friends, that's what they do. They learn how to like read the Quran in Arabic, just the wording, but they don't actually know what's being said. So they kind of learn the recitation of it, but they don't know, kind of like learning some lyrics to like a song in the German language or Latin or some other language that I'm not aware of. Right. So that's kind of what it was. And I'm like, no, I've never really thought about that. It's like, well, what, you're a Muslim. Why don't you try to like understand your own religion? I'm like, that's a pretty novel concept. That kind of makes sense to me. I used to ask questions about things in life. I'm like, we should try to understand what this Islam thing is about that we're supposed to be following. So I go to a bookstore, and there's a ton of bookstores in Mecca around the main mosque where the Kaaba is. This is the building that Islam says that Prophet Ibrahim was the one who built this building, and Muslims go there to visit it. It's kind of like a pilgrimage, like a holy journey. You're supposed to go there at least once in your life as a Muslim. So I go to like one of these bookstores, and there's a lot of English books translated on Islam, and there's like a translation of the Quran. And I'm like, hey, this is a novel idea. I'm like, hey, I'm going to buy a translation of the Quran. So I bought a translation of the Quran. I bought a translation of what's called Sahih al-Bukhari, which is like a collection of the hadiths, which is like the statements and teachings of the Prophet Muhammad. So I was told by this guy who was trying to convince me that, hey, I should try to understand my religion more. So you should really read the original sources of what Islam teaches, so that you can understand, what this religion that you were born into is about. I'm like, yeah, that's a novel concept. That's not a bad idea. So I bought the translation. I bought like a 9-volume translation of Bukhari, and I remember I had stuffed 10 volumes into my backpack because the suitcases were full of like gifts and shopping and stuff from the parents. So I'm carrying this thing back on the airplane, and I get back home, back to America. And I decided I'm going to start reading this. So I start reading the Quran for the first time in English. I start reading these hadiths in English and trying to like make sense of all of it. And I kind of, get very interested. And I'm like, hey, I'm starting to understand what this is. And then I realized like, hey, we're supposed to be praying like 5 times a day as Muslims. I should be doing that. So I decide, what, I'm going to start doing this. I'm going to start taking this Islam thing more seriously. The only problem was that I was very skeptical because the practice of Islam that I saw in my family and friends, it was a very cultural one. So I'm like, I kind of had this mentality that like, it's all culture that they're following. Like they're not even following the correct Islam. So I was highly skeptical, and anything that I didn't like that I came across, I'm like, well, that must have been one of the cultural things. Let me reinterpret it some different way. So if there's some verse in the Quran which I didn't, like or just didn't appeal to me, I'd be like, you know what? That's probably some misunderstanding that these cultural Muslims, like my parents and family members and friends and stuff, misinterpreted. I'm going to interpret it in my own way. And when it came to prayer, everyone was, when they did pray, they would be praying in Arabic. I'd be like, no, I don't need to pray in Arabic. I want to understand the meaning. I already did the whole Arabic without understanding thing. So I'm like, I'm going to pray in English. So I used to pray in English. And then sometimes when I'm driving, I'd be like, why do we need to like do exactly these motions and like bowing and prostration? It's okay. I can just sit in the car and I can just pray. I can even pray when I'm driving if I'm late. God knows my intention. And I'm just gonna, he should accept my prayer. Why wouldn't he accept my prayer? Why do I have to do something a specific way? There must be more flexibility and leniency, than this. So it was kind of like I became interested in Islam and like taking it seriously. But at the same time, I didn't have any teachers. I didn't have any guidance. I was kind of just interpreting the scripture, whether it's the Quran or whether it's these hadith books, on my own. So that was kind of high school, and then I'm going around and telling my friends like, hey, I'm a Muslim and I'm proud to be a Muslim and I believe in Islam, and I'm telling them about it and everything. And that was kind of like my demeanor, but it was kind of like a modified revisionist type of understanding of what Islam is. Fast forward to my freshman year in college, I take this class on critical thinking, a philosophy class, and had an atheist professor who did not hold back at all on his beliefs. And he's basically trying to, constantly just making fun of all religions in the class, day in and day out. And finally, one day, the professor starts talking about, some questions. He's like, who still believes in the truth fairy? I'm like, that's ridiculous. It always bothered me when like my parents told me things and then I found out that they were false. Like, I was told that there's a tooth fairy that actually takes your tooth. And then, so oftentimes kids, they believe that. And then you find out, oh, it was actually a lie. It wasn't really true. They thought it was a joke and they were just trying to be nice and lying to the kids. That always bothered me internally. I'm like, why do you have to lie to me? Like, if you're going to lie to me about this, then you might be lying to me about so many other things that you taught me. So I was taught that like Santa Claus is going to come down the chimney and he left presents under the tree. It's kind of weird. I'm in a Muslim family. Like I said, they're semi-practicing. We had a Christmas tree. We had Christmas presents underneath. We had stockings on the fireplace and all that stuff. So, when you're a kid, you're told like, yeah, there's actually a Santa Claus and he's the one who put the gifts. Maybe at a certain age, you believe it. And, I believed it. Then later on, found out that Santa Claus is not true, not real. So anyways, I'm sitting in the philosophy class and it's like the person's like, there are some people who still believe that Santa Claus is real. I'm like, that's so ridiculous. Only a child would believe something like that. They're like, some people still believe in the tooth fairy. I'm like, oh, that's ridiculous. Only kids believe in that. Then he started talking about fairies and he started talking about spirits. And then he's like, let me ask you guys a question. How many of you guys still believe in God? And it's like the question just like hit me. Like, what do you mean still believe? Like, you're equating like the beliefs of Santa Claus and the tooth fairy and all that, like with God. Like for me, like I'd always, I always thought, this is, in high school, this is in the late 90s. That I'm like, everybody believes in God. And what shocked me was I raised my hand and one other kid raised his hand and everyone else probably they were embarrassed or, they're kind of some kind of agnostic or whatever it was. We're the only two people in the entire class who raised our hand and everyone else kept their hand down. And I was just like shocked beyond belief. I'm like, how can this be? And I looked at the other guy who raised his hand. And this is like the hardcore evangelical Bible thumping guy who shows up at your door like on a Sunday morning kind of Christian guy. And like, they don't, I grew up with not having a very positive view of people like that. So I'm like, that guy, like, what's wrong? And what's going on? Like, am I like that guy? Like, what has happened to me? So I started having like this identity crisis and like a spiritual crisis. And I'm like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm gonna prove this atheist philosophy professor. I'm gonna prove him wrong. So I go to the library and I buy a book called Critiques of God. It's like the best arguments for atheism among like the last 100 years of philosophers, across the board. So I'm like, I'm gonna get this book and I'm gonna like read it and I'm gonna prove him that like he's wrong about all these things and he should believe in God. That plan completely failed because, I think a lot of Muslims assume that they have like a very deep knowledge of Islam just because, you read a few books or you read a translation of the Quran or something like that. So I'm sitting there reading like top class literature, intellectual minds who have these different arguments that they make against, belief in God. So I go and I read this book, I start reading it. I'm like, I don't know how to answer this question. And I don't know how to answer this question. And I'm like, oh man, these are good points. And I don't understand any of this. And eventually that book actually basically converted me into atheism and basically said, you don't have good grounds for believing all this stuff that you're believing, that you're, grew up, even all your zeal that you had in high school and from the translation that you had and everything. And I kept going to that teacher's class, and I got really influenced by him. And I said, you know what? I'm not going to believe any of this stuff anymore. So I basically just left Islam and said, I'm an atheist now. There's no reason for believing in God. These are the arguments. I don't have any answer for them. And I kind of never wanted to follow at that time. I never really wanted to follow the rules of Islam anyways. Like, I want to have a girlfriend, and I want to, have freedom to, do whatever I want to do. So like the restriction of the rules and stuff like that, it's, always kind of felt a little bit limiting, especially, partly because, you grow up in a culture where it's hard to figure out whether the restrictions that your parents put on you are from culture or they're from religion. So I kind of mix both of them together. I'm like, oh man, this is like, nobody likes to, have these restrictions put on them, because especially when you don't understand that they're good for you or what the benefit of them is. So that's kind of my journey to becoming an atheist. And that kind of happened my freshman year of university.
Okay, so you mentioned the book that you read, The Critiques of God, and there were a few points there that converted you to Islam. So what were some of those points?
It was kind of like, I don't remember exactly what they are now. It's been a long time, but it was kind of like the argument from, there had to have been like a first creator, the first cause argument. There was several responses to that, and I didn't know what the counter response was. In terms of everything is designed. So they talk about, well, though that design is inferred, it's already built into your mind. You're kind of born that way, but you have to go outside of that. So it's kind of like mostly responses to the design argument and the first cause argument. It's a book of philosophy, so it was not really. It's designed more for like philosophy students. So those were the two main arguments that were put in there, and a lot of it was like, it was not just the strength of the arguments, but it was more the confidence, almost the overconfidence, almost to say the arrogance of the authors in the way that they would kind of put themselves up and say, we're critical thinkers. We don't, follow any culture. We don't follow what our parents and what our, great grandparents and all that stuff followed. We're independent, free thinkers. We're rational. We're the intellectual ones. These religious people, it's kind of like really putting down religion, saying it's anti-rational, saying that like it's, the people who follow it, they're just blind believers. They don't think properly. And the reason why a lot of that resonated with me really was not so much, in retrospect, it's not so much the strength of the arguments. It's more like you grow up in a society and you grow up in a family where there's like a lot of resentment. It's like, a lot of these, people don't ask proper questions. My family and friends didn't really understand much about Islam. They didn't want to think about things and ask questions and like, well, why do we believe this or why do we believe that? That mentality is not there. So it's kind of their style and their rhetoric that resonated more with me than simply their arguments. So that's, I think a lot of people don't realize that. They don't recognize. They're like, oh man, these are strong arguments. Even when it comes to like neo-atheists, like, Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and these people, oftentimes it's not so much just the arguments that are resonating. It's more like the style and the rhetoric and the way the person's speaking and the way that they're attacking religion. Something happened in your past, or something you experienced, some people, and you're like, those people are ridiculous, or they believe certain things. So it's kind of like it's almost like a different culture that resonates with you.
Okay, thanks. And you also mentioned that one of the reasons why you went to atheism is because of all the restrictions and the rules in Islam. So for our audience out there, a lot of them might have the same thoughts as well. I'm interested in God, I'm interested in Islam, but I don't want all these rules. So can you give some advice to our listeners on that?
Yeah, that's it. That also has it has like a history as well. So like one of the things that I experienced is like, if you're taught certain rules and you're told like, you can't do this. And then when you ask like, well, why? Like, why can't we drink alcohol? Or like, why can't we eat pork? It's like, because God said so. And like, but like, why? It's like, but don't ask questions. So like when you're taught something and you're like told you need to obey and you need to follow, and you better not ask any questions and you better not try to think that there's a reasoning behind it, then eventually you get to a point where you kind of get shut down and you're like, there probably is no reason behind it at all. It's like, God wants you to stand on one foot for an hour. You're going to do that. It makes no sense at all. You can't even try to think about it because there's no rational reason or any wisdom behind why that is. And that mentality just kind of sinks into your heart and into your mind. And I think that's one of the things that, really turns people off. And that really turned me off. It's like everything is like, you just got to do it because. And when that's the mentality, you can appreciate what's actually there. Later on, I mean, looking at it in retrospect and now understanding what I understand, it's like in Islam, there's one principle in Islam. Every one who studies Islamic law, and the rules in Islam knows this. And that is that every single thing that God has prescribed for us to do or to stay away from, it has a massive benefit for the person. Like there is a wisdom and there is some good either for the individual or for the society, right? So sometimes, you're like, well, I want to do this, but it'll feel good for me. But on a societal level, it's not good for society. So, I mean, if you look at alcohol as an example, alcohol is a perfect example. It's like when you don't drink, it's very clear that there's harms of drinking. There's personal harms as well as there's societal harms, drinking and driving, DUIs and going in, there's date rape, and then there's beating up your family and, doing all sorts of, ridiculous things. So alcohol is like one of the easiest examples to understand. When it comes to like, dating and premarital relationships outside of marriage and things like that, it's the same thing. It's like, when people are in a marriage relationship, for them to, be intimate, it just means that they're taking the relationship more seriously. I mean, that's really the definition of marriage in Islam. Somewhat modified. I mean, it's problematic because from a Christian perspective, it's like till death do you part. Kind of in Hinduism, it used to be similar traditionally. It's like once you're in, you're there is no divorce. Like that's completely not something that's even available or possible. Well, the thing is, when you look into Islam, that's not the case. I mean, there's an entire chapter in the Quran called divorce. So divorce is something allowed if the marriage is not working out. So that kind of redefines what marriage is. And when you understand what marriage actually is in Islam, and you realize like what the purpose of marriage is, now you're like, oh, now I understand the purpose of not having a relationship outside of marriage. So like, a young Muslim growing up as a teenager being like, why can't I have a girlfriend? Why can't I have a boyfriend? Well, because God wants you to take your relationship with your boyfriend or girlfriend very seriously. And the seriousness is manifested in you getting married and showing basically going into a commitment where we're saying, I'm going to take this physical relationship at a serious level by declaring that it's a marriage in front of my friends and family and stuff like that. So like when you start to, reflect on the wisdom behind everything, you're like, oh, there's like a reason behind all of these things. None of them is like just none of them is just like, just because you can't do it. There's always like some good reason behind it. So I mean, that's what I would remind everyone. It's like, if you just ask some questions and try to understand, sometimes you'll ask maybe a question to a Muslim and they're just like, well, you just do it because God said so. I mean, technically that's true. You do it because God said so, but God didn't say so for no random reason. He has some wisdom behind it. Oftentimes we can understand, at least at some level, the wisdom behind it. Sometimes we can see it holistically. Sometimes we can see part of it. Sometimes there's a hint or an indication about it. And I think that really helps resolve the problem for a lot of people. That really helped resolve the issues for me. I'm like, hey, if God's telling us what not to do and what to do because it's actually for our own greater good, okay, that makes sense. I can do that. And then I can understand that on several issues. Like, I'm glad I have some of these restrictions so I don't do something dumb and like, get into drugs or get into, alcoholism or something like that.
Now, at the start, you mentioned, the problem of this cultural way of Islam. You were brought up and it felt like your family were practicing a cultural way of Islam. So for our listeners out there, the ones that are thinking about converting to Islam or even the new Muslims, can you explain or give them advice on things to watch out for and to avoid this cultural way of Islam?
So, I mean, the easiest way to avoid this cultural understanding of Islam is that people study Islam from its direct sources as well as from Muslim scholars. So people who are specialized in that. So what culture really is I'm going to follow what my parents taught me and what my parents and my uncles and my aunts and my friends and everyone else did. And it's like, well, where did they learn it from? Well, they just learned it from their parents and their uncles and their aunts and their friends. And okay, well, is anyone in that area like knowledgeable and specialized and reads books and, on any level? And if the answer is no, that's where the cultural understanding comes from. It's just like, well, this is kind of what we heard. It's kind of like hearsay. It's hearsay, basically. We heard this from someone in our family somewhere, and this is kind of like what we did. Did you verify it? Did you check if like these are actual Islamic teachings? No. So it's almost like, there's a difference between somebody saying, well, I when I get sick, I'm going to take the medicine that, my friends and family always told me that I should take. So if you get the flu, they always told me you should drink a cup of coffee. It's like, okay, that's interesting. But have you checked that with like any medical professionals who are actually like specialized in medicine and studied the human body? Do they also recommend that you just drink a cup of coffee like when you get the flu or you get sick or something like that? Oh, no, that's not the case. Well, now you have basically a cultural understanding of medicine that you just kind of inherited and you just keep passing it down throughout the generations. So to solve that problem, you go to people who are specialized. You go to doctors who actually study medicine and they study the human body and they read what other doctors have said. So that's really what it comes down to. Same thing with Islam. You go to people who are scholars, people who are specialized, and you say, well, what have 1400 years of Muslim scholarship, the people who are known and recognized, experts in this field, who are practicing, who pray, who are dedicated to the religion, what have these people said? Right. And when something in the cultural understanding of Islam contradicts what all these people have been saying, then you're like, oh, well, then now it's very clear to me which one is clear, like true Islam, and what is the cultural understanding of Islam. Right. So just to give you a simple example, in some parts of the world, there are Muslims who, when they get married, they will the bride's family or the bride is supposed to give an amount of money as a gift to the husband or to the husband's family. Now, this is in Hindu culture and in some other cultures in the world. But this, and they think like this is part of Islam. This is exactly the opposite, because Islam actually teaches that there's something called the mahr, or the dower, where the man is supposed to give it to the woman who he's marrying as a gift, as a bridal gift. Now, sometimes they flip it around and they say, okay, well, yes, the man gives it to the woman's family and she gets to keep this money. It's like, no, that's not the way it works. He has to give it to the woman. So people have ideas like this on all sorts of strange things, whether it comes to marriage or when it comes to divorce, or maybe sometimes when it comes to food, or sometimes even when it comes to prayer, or when it comes to something to do with fasting or any other part of Islam. So the simple way to, one is to just look out for it and to realize that, hey, not every single Muslim is a true ambassador of what the authentic teachings of Islam actually are. So you just kind of, you got to do a little peer review, you got to do a little fact checking. And, you don't go to like Google to do fact checking. You don't necessarily go and ask like, oh, 2 or 3 of my Muslim friends that, I met at like, the Arab falafel shop, let me ask them, what Islam teaches. I mean, they can probably tell you some basics like that Muslims pray 5 times a day and kind of what prayer looks like. But if you want to like get clarity on something where people have misconceptions or it's a more of a difficult issue, it's just like medicine. You don't go and ask your friend, be like, hey, I have this really bad pain in my foot. What do you suggest I do? You wouldn't do that. If it's really bad and you want to make sure that you have a good assessment of it, you go and you ask someone who's specialized. So really seeking out knowledgeable, qualified, balanced Muslim scholars recognized by the greater Muslim community, people who have credentials, studied in Islamic university, those type of scholars, they're the ones who will help clarify what true Islam is or authentic Islam is from just a cultural understanding of Islam.
Yeah, that's great advice. Because, when people first come into Islam, for example, they visit the mosque and then they've got all of this advice coming to them from every person. And most of the people at the mosque are just normal worshippers, that they just have the general knowledge and they're getting advice. So you have to, it's difficult for a new Muslim to understand what to accept and what to not, and then they have to go and research it. So it becomes quite overwhelming.
Yep, absolutely. And that's a huge challenge. And it's something that just needs to be pointed out over and over again, because there's so many people that go down that mistaken path of just asking random people as if like everyone's supposed to just know it, And it's understandable why that happens. Part of it's because, the Quran and Islam is a very simple religion. It's very easy to understand. It's nothing convoluted, nothing that difficult about it. There's no like mysterious notions like the Trinity and how do you reconcile that. It's a pretty simple religion to understand. But when it comes to some details, they do require some specialization. So I think people, what they do is they assume, and there's like this notion that, well, Islam is so simple and it's so easy, everyone should just know everything about it. That's not exactly the case. It is true. Islam is simple. Islam is easy. It makes sense, all of that stuff. But there are aspects of it where you do need to make sure with a specialist about certain things that need more clarification.
Okay, so we left off on the story. You explained to us that you became atheist. You were a hardcore atheist. So what happened next?
Mm-hmm. So that continued for about maybe a year or two. And, I'm going with, I was never really associating with Muslims at all. I mean, pretty much my entire life outside of like Sunday school and like family, my parents' friends get-togethers or something like that. So, I'm in college and I'm not associating with any Muslims. I'm not joining any Muslim student association or anything like that. I want to have nothing to do with them. And now it's like, now I really don't want to have anything to do with them. So I'm just hanging out with my friends, enjoying myself, start going to, nightclubs and kind of like doing a little bit partying, start going to some raves. Rave is like kind of like a trance, a party where you listen to like electronic music and stuff like that, sometimes in the desert, sometimes in other places. So I'm doing all of that. And I start getting into street racing. So I have some of my friends and they're not good influence. And they're like, you know what, let's drive our cars like really fast and show how cool we are. And it's not really something cool. It's actually very dangerous. So I get into street racing and I've been doing this for a while now. And then I'm at home one day. I wake up. My father had given me money to invest in the stock market. The stock market crashes that day. I'm really upset. I'm mad at my parents. I just don't like all the rules and the cultural and stuff and all that. So I finally decide, you know what? I'm getting in my car and I'm running away from home. So jump in my car, put all my stuff in there. And I'm like, you know what? I'm out of here. See ya. Jump in the car. I leave, driving down towards like San Diego, maybe going and crossing over to Mexico. I have like some money that my dad had put into my bank account as like a safeguard. I'm like, I can use all that money to go get my degree in computer science as a programmer. Don't have to deal with any of this stuff, ever again. So I started going on my way. All of a sudden, this Nissan 300ZX twin turbo pulls up next to me and gives me the racing signal. So I'm like, oh man, I'm in a really bad mood. This is not the time to like, you picked the wrong day of all days to like try to challenge me to a race. So I'm just like, you know what? I'm going to take this guy. So we start racing, and, long story short, I'm going really, really fast, and I'm really upset, and I'm mad, and I'm, running away from home at the same time. And I take a very dangerous, route. I do some dangerous maneuvers, and my car spins out of control. Spins around out of control. I end up hitting 3 other cars at a very high speed on the freeway. My car is completely totaled. The running away from home was a complete failure because I ended up going to the hospital. I ended up going back home again. So what happened was, I have the police officer come, and he's like, you know what, kid, you're going to jail because you were going so fast and you got into an accident. This is considered to be illegal. Not only illegal, this is considered to be like a major offense. This is a felony. I'm going to make sure you go to jail. Now, I'm just a teenager still. I'm like 19 at the time. I don't know if he was threatening me, but it seemed pretty real. Like, there is a law that if you're going over 100 miles an hour, you could potentially go to jail because it's considered attempted manslaughter. So now I'm just like completely freaking out. Like, what am I supposed to do? So there's nothing that I can do. I don't know. Like, there's no way I can get out of this. There's no tactic, or my dad can't pay somebody off or something like that. I'm like, my life is over. I'm gonna go to jail, and I'm gonna be in prison, and like I don't know for how long, and like all my fun and clubbing and raving and all that stuff. Like, my life is over basically. So I just decide in a moment of desperation. I'm just like, there's nothing I can do. I guess all I can do is like pray. But I don't believe in prayer because I don't believe in God at the time. So I decide, you know what, there's just nothing else. There's no other way I can get out of this. So I raise my hands in prayer, and I make this prayer, and I say, you know what, God, I don't know. I don't believe that you exist, and I don't know if you really exist. But if you do, get me out of this somehow. And I promise that if you get me out of this, I didn't say like I'm going to become like a good believer or Muslim or something like that. So if you get me out of this, I will at least try my best seriously to take life more seriously and try to find out whether you exist or not. Like, that was like my watered down like prayer. That was like my lowest level of like commitment or promise that I can make. So what ends up happening is nobody presses charges, never see the police officer again. All the charges are dropped against me. I need to go to traffic school. I have 2 points on my record, but I don't end up going to jail. So then from there, I start thinking, and I start having these thoughts, and I'm like, you know what? Was I just doing that because I was emotional? I mean, like, a lot of people, what they'll do is like, oh, you were just emotional and you didn't know what you were doing, and you don't need to fulfill your promise. Like, it's okay. Just continue your life as normal. Something in me just said, you know what? No, like, what kind of person am I? Like, I just make these very serious promises. And like, if I'm just going to break it and just go back and be like, no, it was just an emotional thing. I just made this prayer, whatever it is, and I'm out of it. No, it's all coincidence. It just happened randomly. I don't need to take it seriously. I decided, no, I'm going to keep this promise, and I'm going to be very serious about it. And I also had some family friends coming and telling me like, you know what, God saved you. Your car was totaled, but you didn't have a scratch on your body. Like, you should have been dead. I mean, how fast you were going, you should have at least had some broken bones, or you probably normally, if you were going that fast, you should have died, right? So, you don't go this fast without, I won't mention how fast it is just for legal reasons, but it's really, really fast, and no one should ever be driving this fast. So So they're telling me like God saved you for a reason. I'm like, yeah, whatever. I don't even believe in God. I don't know why you keep telling me this, but it's sitting in the back of my mind. It's kind of like simmering. So I got this promise that I made, and I got this thought of like, did I really get saved? Like, should I think about this? So I decided, you know what, I'm going to take this seriously. I boycott my friends completely. I'm like, you know what? They're like, come on, let's go racing again. I'm like, I don't want to race anymore. It's like, let's go to the rave. I'm like, I don't want to waste time anymore. I don't want to hang out with you guys anymore. I don't want to do anything. I am now on a mission, and I'm a serious individual. I want to find out, number one, whether God exists, and number two, whether there's a purpose in life. Like, this is a promise that I made. It's a promise that I made to God, who I'm not sure exists, and I promise that I made to myself. So I'm going to fulfill this promise, and it's going to take a lot of effort, because before I wasn't putting in proper effort. Even when I read that book on atheism, in freshman year of college, I wasn't really much of a reader at all. So I wasn't really reading it at a very serious level. I wasn't really reflecting that deeply, because that was not my thing. So I'm like, but now I'm going to have to do this on a serious level. So long story short, I'm in UC, or University of California, Irvine, doing a computer science degree. I decided, you know what, I'm dropping out of school. So I drop out of school, and I go to the same school's library every single morning. And I show up at the 8 o'clock or something, 7 o'clock when it opens in the morning. And I stay there the entire day. And I keep reading books on the subject of atheism, of different religions, and until the library closes every single day. So I'm like, I'm going to study all the religions, including atheism, and find out, which one of these is the truth. After a while, looking into different religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism, all of these things, I start narrowing it down. I'm like, you know what? For me, the only religion that actually potentially makes sense is actually Islam. It's kind of coincidentally that it happened to be my family, but it's more of a choice. It's not so much like, oh, well, that's the religion that my parents raised me with, or something like that. It's really more like kind of issue with Judaism was more like there's like this too much emphasis on the bloodline and lineage, and like, from the chosen people. And I'm like, well, I'm not from that special people that, God has chosen. There's something about like your blood and, you inheriting that. And then with Christianity, Trinity didn't make any sense to me, and Jesus being God and stuff like that. And Buddhism, the idolatry, that Buddhism turned into, and also not really believing in afterlife and the reincarnation and the evidence for reincarnation didn't really resonate with me. And then even though they have some nice principles for meditation and, life and mindfulness and all that stuff. And then Hinduism was just so much full of idol worship. And I'm like, did that idol, the little that I learned about Islam was like, it's idol worship just doesn't make sense. Why would you worship something that, people you've created with your own hands? So that was, quickly discarded as well. So I'm like, I'm narrowing it down between atheism or Islam. And every day I would just hit the library. I just keep reading books on both topics. Now, I read whatever's available. I have no guide to like help me through any of these books. Hey, you should check this book. Don't read that book. That's not really the right book for you at this moment in time. So I start doing that. And, like after about, 6 months or so, I decide that, what, Islam is the right religion for me. And I choose it. I start joining Islamic schools, end up traveling to India and keep on studying, and eventually end up becoming an imam after a few years.
That's great. So you mentioned it took you 6 months. So was that 6 months after you were sitting in the library doing all of that research?
Yes.
Okay. And can you remember the point? Is it still in your memory, the time or that period of time where you said to yourself, yes, this is it. I'm now committed. I'm now going to be a Muslim.
I think sometimes maybe some people have like this one specific moment where they're like, you know what, I remember it was the day and it was the time and it was the place where all of a sudden just like clicked for me. And that happens with me like on some thoughts. But my process, I don't think it was that. It was more like, it was just a process of like resisting certain ideas, like this doesn't make sense, this doesn't make sense. And then I read it, I'm like, it's kind of starting to make sense a little bit now. So I'm like being a little bit more open to, something I was very close to. I'm like, I'm kind of open to, considering this viewpoint. And it just kind of like kept on building up over time. And, it's like a very gradual process, a slow process of like answering several of my questions. Oftentimes when you get some questions answered, brand new questions come up, and just kind of like categorizing the questions that are essential and the questions that are not essential. And then eventually at some point, I'm like, you know what? Most of the essential questions make sense and they've been answered for me. And the new questions and the other unanswered questions are really not that crucial. Like I can get them answered over time. I'm going to keep searching, but I don't have to have all the answers, but I have the most important answers that I really need. And then I'm like, you know what? I think this is the right way to go. And I'm going to go ahead and, I'm going to start praying. I'm going to start practicing. I'm going to do that. So that's kind of what happened.
And was it all an uphill path from there? Or did you have times where you sort of wavered back down and your belief went down again?
Oh, yeah. Several of them. I mean, it wasn't always uphill from there, but I think once there came a point where, in those 6 months or so, it was kind of up and down, questioning back and forth. But once I kind of made my decision, it was never going back into like skepticism and questioning, like, did I make the right decision? No, there was a point where I reached and I'm like, this is it. I'm confident now. What happened was I kind of changed my mentality, because my mentality was like, I need to have every single question answered. And then what changed was, it's like, no, I'm confident now in what I believe. And I don't need every question answered. Now, I'm not going to dismiss the question, but I would love to get these questions answered someday, but it's not essential. So my inability to get an answer to these questions or these, confusions or doubts or whatever it is, it's not strong enough to break the foundation of faith that I've built up over time. So that's kind of how it happened.
So how long ago was that when you actually fully converted back?
That was my sophomore year of college. That was, let me think, 1999. That was the year 2000.
Okay, great. So it's been about 20 odd years.
20 years, yeah, 22 years.
And so I like the point that you made before, when you were having your problem, and this happens to all of us. We started, saying to God, praying to God. And I like how you said, I don't know if you exist. So you're actually praying to God, but saying at the same time saying, I don't know you exist. I find that, that's nice. And then in the Quran, it also says something like this. There's a verse talking about how when we're in problems, we turn to God. Can you give our listeners a little explanation about that verse in the Quran?
Sure. Yeah. So there's this verse that, the people who are worshiping idols during the lifetime of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, they're worshiping idols, and the Quran addresses them and says, you guys worship these idols that, you make with yourselves, but that there's one creator of the entire universe, the entire world. And when you're out at sea and you're like, there's like a storm that comes and you're afraid for what's happening and you don't have your idols with you, you're not at the shrine with the idols there, who do you call upon? You start calling upon God. You start calling upon the creator. You don't even call upon the idols. And then it says, but what happens is, and it's basically saying that what you do. This is what most people do when they're in some kind of dilemma or something. They call upon God because they know deep down inside that like the idols, can't really do much. It's the one creator who made everything that actually has the power to do that. So it says you do that. But then when you come back and the storm is gone and you're safe and everything like that, you forget all those promises that you made, and you forget all of that you were praying to God. And now you're like, oh, let's go back to our old religion of idol worship again. So like, that verse in the Quran, really resonates with me a lot, because that's always like, I got to that point. It's like people make these promises and people start acting a certain way when there's like a very big difficulty. And then later on, they just kind of dismiss it. And it's tempting to dismiss it And you can either say, oh, I was just being emotional or something, but it's actually the other way around. See, Islam teaches that what happens is people who are arrogant, people don't want to take life seriously. Some illness comes, some sickness comes, car accident comes, something comes to wake them up from the delusion in which they've been living their life, and to take life more seriously, to reflect upon the purpose of life more seriously. And that's exactly what people need. Sometimes people need to be shaken up to start thinking about the important questions in life. And it's easy when that wake up call is kind of stops ringing in your ears, that alarm clock stops ringing. It's like, oh, let me just go back to sleep. And the Quran is saying, don't do that. You're not supposed to do that. Stay awake. Utilize the benefit of that wake up call. It was not just some random delusion or something like that. You needed that. And you were actually in the right state of mind. You actually had mental clarity when you were going through that. So utilize that and follow through on those feelings and those thoughts that you had when you could actually see clearly, and don't go back to sleep and don't go back into your delusionary state.
So we're coming up to our final question now. I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your story. It's been very inspirational, and I'm sure our listeners are going to benefit from this as well.
Pleasure.
So the final question is something that all our listeners, they want to know. So they're out here, they're listening to this, they're wondering about Islam, they're thinking about converting to Islam. So what advice do you have to them? What sort of steps should they take, and what should they do to come to this truth?
Yeah, so I mean, the general answer, it's a little bit different for everyone, but the general answer would be is that, try to understand who the Prophet Muhammad is by just understanding a little bit about his life. You don't have to even read an entire book, but just have a general understanding of who he was, what was he like, and reflect upon his simplicity, reflect upon his mission, reflect upon how he used to deal with people and the opportunities that he had. And one of the things that, it's pretty easy for someone to conclude is that this person is not an imposter. This person is not somebody, when you understand what he did and who he was and how he behaved, how he acted with people, you have to ask yourself, I mean, is this person a true prophet? Does he seem to be a true prophet, or does he seem to be a false prophet? And the answer should hopefully come to, it's not hard for it to arrive that he's the true prophet. And then you ask and you look a little bit about the teachings of the Quran and try to understand kind of what the Quran teaches. Even if you don't read the entire thing, just reading parts of it, you're like, does this seem like it's an authentic, true message that's coming from God, the creator of the worlds? And it doesn't take that much effort or energy or thought to figure out that, yes, it does. So I think, identifying what are the core questions for someone to understand what is Islam asking, what is Islam teaching, and what is Islam asking you to do, right? What is Islam telling you that this world is about? Who's your God? Who's your creator? Why were you created? And what's going to happen to you? I mean, your belief in that and your selection of a religion or a philosophy or lack of selection is going to, determine who you are as a person. And it's going to determine, what happens to you after you die. So I would just say, really reflect on those things. Try to understand Islam on a zoomed out level, just as a whole. And if you come to the conclusion that, yes, I am inclined to believe that the Quran is the word of God. It's the book, that final revelation that was sent. And I am inclined to believe that the Prophet Muhammad was a true messenger of God and a true prophet. Then I would say that you should make the declaration of faith. You should go ahead and make the testification and say, yes, I declare that there is no one worthy of worship besides the one and only true God. Allah is the Arabic word for him. And I declare that Muhammad is the messenger of God. And you should either go and visit a local mosque or try to find a Muslim scholar or online or something like that. officially make your declaration and get some literature. Try and get yourself enrolled in some program which can help you understand what to do after you become a Muslim. And try to be part of the Muslim community as much as you can while learning, as much as you're able to, given your life circumstances, your job and all of that stuff. This would be my advice.
Thank you, Imam Mustafa. Thanks for that advice. And thanks for coming onto the show as well. I really appreciate it. Thanks for sharing your story. All of the resources, all of Imam Mustafa's resources are in the show notes below. All of the links to all of his books. You can have a look at his the California Islamic University. Check out some of the courses there. If you have any questions, there's another link for some Q&A questions that you can ask. And so this has been another episode of Onto Islam, Becoming Muslim. If anyone has any questions, you can also go to our ontoislam.com website. We have plenty of articles there. And we also have a live Q&A session if anyone's interested in asking questions about converting to Islam. So I'll leave you now with the words of peace. May the blessings of God be on you all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.